I decided to make a separate section for the extruding setup. We're through the rough setup and we had calculated the gear diameter and the number of teeth, the circumference, and we actually put in that rough figures into the config file and uploaded it. And if you don't happen to remember what it was 26 teeth using the Excel spreadsheet I had, and it told me the mod and the design OD, so that was 11.2 millimeter. So we've done the circumference, counted the number of steps. We took it to be still 16 micro steps. So then we just divided the total number of steps and micro steps, 3,200, by the circumference, which was 35.18, and we come out to 90.9457. So we just put in 91 into the config and we uploaded that. That's the rough calibration, and as I said, in the rough calibration we roughly measured it and got the config in the figures that make sense to us. So we ignore the manual figures and we ignore the original figures in the config, so we've got something that represents our printer. So we're up to GO4, verify extruder motor extrude and reverse motion, and that is page 196. Add a bookmark to that. Now with the LCD, like I mentioned before, you have your actual temperature measurements and your set temperature measurements. If there's no connectors wrong or all that sort of thing, it's 0. So you'll see 0, 0 at the bottom. If it's not the ambient air temperature, that means there's an error. So it's been programmed not to operate if it's at 0. But it's also not programmed to operate, this is extruding that, under a minimum temperature. So that's so as when you're heating up your extrusion, your hot end, it needs to get up to temperature to melt plastic. And if you try shoving the plastic filament through before it's melted, it causes problems. So it's set at 170 on the config, and there's important note, define extrude min temp 170, and that stops the extruder motor from operating. So if you've got 0, you've got a problem. If you're 165 degrees, you can't extrude. So we're only doing a test. We're only just calibrating motors, make sure they go in the right direction, and we're also going to do the feed rate, which isn't in the manual at all. So they've come up with a code, M code, that's M302, that tells the software, look, at this time, ignore the minimum temperature. We're just going to do something else with it. So that's M302. So you need that sent before the actual motor will operate. You have to check forward and reverse. On the Pontiface graphic user interface screen, there's an extrude and a reverse. So when it's connected, you click on that and you look at the motor. Now to extrude, the motor's got to go anti-clockwise. So the gears are actually pushing the filament up. Reverse, the motor's actually coming back down to pull the filament down, so it's clockwise. So you send your M302 code once you're connected, and then you can do that forward and reverse. I will do that in a minute because the motors will start up and it's a bit more quiet at the moment. However, you may do that and think it's going in the wrong direction. Part of this is because we're using the standard colour setting for all the motor plugs. So we had the red on the left and all that sort of stuff. So they're all in the same position. So depends on which way the motor needs to go, it may need to be reversed. On my particular machine, now I'm not saying this is set for everyone else, mine was reversing. Now it only says here, observe the motors, extrude is supposed to go clockwise, reverse is counterclockwise. For their setup, that might necessarily be our setup, but it doesn't tell you how to fix it. So that's why this is a bit more detail. I'm going to show you how to fix it. So we just go back into Notepad++. If you do a search, say for stepper, or you do a search for extruder, or you just go to line 350, or you do a search for hash define space invert underscore ER underscore directory dir, you'll get there. So they are all false, 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 which means you don't have to change it. Make sure your motor plug is on EO, the first one, because it's got EO, E1 and E2. So you just come down to EO dir where it says false, and you just highlight that in, type in true, and then that means the software will say, oh, instead of going that way, you go that way. Then go back up to the top, go to line, for this is line 19, put in the change that you've changed that direction, EO direction changed to true, and line 350, so that you now know what you've changed. Then change the date to today's date and the time to the time right now. Then save it, then upload it through the Arduino. So you do that, then switch on with Frontabase. You then send your M302, then you do the test. Now, should have changed. If it hasn't, you could be connected to E1 or E2, or you might have changed E1 or E2 instead of EA. So then you go back and you know what line it is straight away. Don't have to search. You know what you've changed, and you can look, oh, okay, I've done the wrong one, I've done the right one. So once it's going in the right direction, you're ready to do the calibration. So I'll fire up the beast. I'll now connect the favourite steel rule. Now here's a tip for doing the extrusion, getting your filament right. Get yourself a pair of side cutters and cut your filament on a 45-degree angle, so it's narrow, so that it's easier to feed through the knitting needle hole, the sewing hole. Easy to fit through. But also the plastic, if you unreel the plastic, will go in big circles. So when you're trying to feed it through, if you have the curve of the circle pointing away from the hole, each time you push it up, it will curve away from the hole. So what you do, make sure you feed it so as the curve is going in the same curve as a roller or the gear, but not away from it. So it's in this plane, it's flat. As you know, I've made the modification, if you watched that video, where I've just got an old nozzle and drilled it out, and that's the guide for when you use that extra flexible material. If there's a blockage of that, it doesn't start pushing on itself. I also just got a little piece of 2mm, 3mm tube, Teflon tube, and I just cut up off 50mm, and that just sits on the actual filament. Reason for that is if you have dust and all that on your filaments, rather than working its way up into the head, this has got the belt and tube that gets rid of a lot of it. But even if you've got a direct head, just put a piece like that, and that will help wipe off any dust and hair and whatnot. Also, in the quick connect on this surface, it's got a step recess counterbore. So when you try pushing up the filament, sometimes it hits on the side instead of going through the hole. You can get a little drill. I think it's flat bottom in there, but if you get just a little drill the same size, and just with the chuck I showed you in the very beginning for counterboring, you can just make a little chamfer, and that will help guide. What I did is I just cut off a piece of this tubing, slit it, because it's just a little bit bigger than that hole. Just slid it down, made it the right distance, pushed it in, and now it's the same direction all the way through. So I can push it up quite easy backwards and forwards. So that's setting up your filament. That's the holder that I spoke about. That's the one I designed up to have the high and the wide and the narrow holders. You've got your adjustment. The tension I haven't got over tight at the moment. We'll see how it goes when it's running and pushing through, if I have to adjust that. They're nipped up and tight. I've taken the tube off for the next step. As you remember, we calculated the gear 90.9457, so we made it 91. Now I then went back and I extruded 50mm, and I measured it and it was 45. Here I am thinking it's going to be exactly, it was 45. So then what I did was I said, right, 50 went out, it was supposed to go out, only 45 went out. So it means that I need to send more out. So I divided 50 by 45, got that number, and multiplied that by my 91 steps. And that became then 101.1, and I put in 101 and tried that. Then it came out at 51. So I sent out 50 and 51 come out 1 mil longer. Before it was 5 mil shorter, now it was 1 mil longer. So I then rounded it down to 100 to see what difference it could make. And that's where we're up to now. And I'll explain how to do your test. So you can change that 91 to 100 and go from there. It's up to you.